Margaret Williams had worked as a housekeeper for the wealthy Henderson family for over 20 years. She knew every corner of the grand mansion, every secret whispered in its halls, and every shadow that danced across its marble floors. At 62, her weathered hands had polished every piece of furniture, and her keen eyes had witnessed the family's rise and fall through the decades. The Henderson family owned one of the largest tech companies in the state. Robert Henderson, the patriarch, had built his empire from nothing, starting with a small computer repair shop in his garage. Now, at 78, he lay bedridden in the master bedroom, his once powerful voice reduced to weak whispers. The doctors said he had weeks, maybe days left. Margaret had always been more than just hired help to the family. She had raised Robert's children when their mother died young, comforted them through their troubles, and celebrated their successes. The Henderson children had grown up calling her Aunt Maggie, though she was never truly considered family in the legal sense. Robert had 3 children: Thomas, the eldest at 45, who ran the marketing department of the family business; Sarah, 42, who had moved to Europe and rarely visited; and Michael, the youngest at 38, who had always been the black sheep of the family. Michael struggled with gambling and had accumulated massive debts over the years. On a cold Tuesday morning in November, Margaret was cleaning the hallway when she heard raised voices coming from Robert's study. Thomas and Michael were arguing loudly while their father lay unconscious upstairs. "The will is clear, Michael," Thomas said firmly. "Father is leaving the company to me. You'll get a settlement, but that's it." "That's not fair," Michael shouted back. "I'm his son too. I deserve an equal share." "You've already cost this family millions with your gambling debts," Thomas replied coldly. "Father made his decision years ago." Margaret quietly continued her work, but her heart ached for the family she had watched crumble over money and pride. She remembered when the boys were young, playing together in the same study where they now fought over their inheritance. Later that evening, Margaret was bringing Robert his medication when she noticed something strange. A young black girl, no more than 16, was standing by Robert's bedside. The girl wore a simple dress and had an old-fashioned appearance that seemed out of place in the modern bedroom. "Excuse me, dear," Margaret said gently. "Are you lost? How did you get in here?" The girl turned to face Margaret with the most unusual eyes. They seemed ancient, despite her young face. "My name is Grace," she said in a voice that carried an odd echo. "I've been waiting for you, Margaret Williams." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Waiting for me? Child, I don't understand. Who are you?" Grace pointed toward Robert's desk where important papers were scattered. "The will," she said simply. "He mustn't change it. Something terrible will happen if the wrong person touches those papers." Margaret looked confused. "What are you talking about?" "Mr. Henderson is unconscious. He can't change anything." "Not him," Grace said, her young face growing serious. "Someone else will try to change it tomorrow night. Someone who thinks they deserve more than they were given." Before Margaret could ask more questions, Grace seemed to fade away like morning mist, leaving Margaret alone with the sleeping patriarch. Margaret rubbed her eyes, wondering if exhaustion was making her see things that weren't there. The next day, Margaret couldn't shake the memory of the strange girl. She found herself checking on Robert's study more frequently, making sure everything was in order. The will was locked in a safe behind a painting of Robert's late wife, but Margaret noticed that someone had been moving things around on the desk. That evening, Thomas came to visit his father. He spent an hour in the bedroom, reading business reports aloud even though Robert couldn't respond. After Thomas left, Margaret went upstairs to check on her employer. "Mr. Henderson?" she whispered. To her surprise, Robert's eyes fluttered open. "Maggie," he said weakly. "My will. Someone will try to change it. You must protect it." Margaret's blood ran cold as she remembered Grace's warning. Who Mr. Henderson? Who would do such a thing? But Robert had already slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving Margaret with more questions than answers. Late that night, Margaret heard footsteps in the study downstairs. She crept quietly from her small room near the kitchen and peered around the corner. Michael was in the study, frantically searching through papers on his father's desk. His hands were shaking, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. Margaret watched in horror as Michael found the combination to the safe, hidden in a small notebook. He opened the safe and pulled out several legal documents, including Robert's will. In the lamplight, Margaret could see Michael's face twisted with desperation and greed. Michael spread the will on the desk and pulled out a pen. He began carefully erasing and rewriting portions of the document, changing the distribution of assets to give himself a larger share of the inheritance. His forgery skills were surprisingly good, suggesting this wasn't the first time he had altered important documents. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized she was witnessing exactly what Grace had warned her about. She wanted to confront Michael immediately, but something held her back. A voice in her mind, Grace's voice, whispered, "Wait. Watch. Learn." As Michael worked on the forgery, Margaret noticed something strange happening in the room. The temperature seemed to drop, and shadows began moving independently of their sources. Michael was so focused on his illegal work that he didn't notice the supernatural activity surrounding him. Grace appeared again, standing directly behind Michael, but he couldn't see her. She looked at Margaret and shook her head sadly. "He doesn't know what he's bringing upon himself and his family," Grace said. "The dead don't rest when justice is denied." Margaret watched in fascination and terror as Grace reached out toward the forged will. Where her fingers touched the paper, small burn marks appeared, but Michael remained unaware of the ghostly presence. When Michael finished his forgery, he carefully placed the altered will back in the safe and cleaned up all evidence of his crime. He looked around the study one final time before leaving, unaware that 2 witnesses had observed every detail of his deception. After Michael left, Grace turned to Margaret one final time. "Tomorrow, they will read the false will. The truth must come to light, or this family will face a curse that will destroy them all." Margaret knew she faced an impossible choice. Expose Michael's crime and tear the family apart, or stay silent and risk whatever supernatural consequences Grace had warned about. Robert Henderson died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later. Margaret was the one who found him that morning, his face serene and free from the pain that had plagued his final weeks. She had grown to love the old man like family, and her tears were genuine as she called the family to deliver the sad news. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday afternoon. The church was packed with business associates, employees, and community members whose lives Robert had touched through his charity work. Margaret sat in the back, dressed in her best black dress, watching as the family she had served for decades said their final goodbyes. Thomas delivered a moving eulogy about his father's legacy and dedication to family values. Sarah had flown in from London and wept openly during the service. Michael sat quietly in the front pew, his face showing what appeared to be genuine grief, though Margaret wondered if he was thinking about the forged will hidden in the safe. After the burial, the family gathered at the mansion for the reading of the will. The family lawyer, elderly Mr. Brennan, had been Robert's legal counsel for over 30 years. He arrived with his briefcase and a solemn expression, ready to fulfill his final duty to his old friend. The immediate family assembled in Robert's study, the same room where Margaret had witnessed Michael's crime just days earlier. Thomas sat confidently in his father's chair, clearly expecting to inherit control of the family business. Sarah perched nervously on the edge of the sofa, still jet-lagged from her international flight. Michael paced by the window, trying to appear casual, despite the nervous energy radiating from his every movement. Margaret was asked to stay for the reading since Robert had always considered her part of the family. She stood quietly by the door, her hands clasped tightly as she watched Mr. Brennan open the safe and retrieve the documents. "Before we begin," Mr. Brennan announced, "I want you all to know that your father updated his will just 6 months ago. He was very specific about his wishes for the family and the business." Margaret's heart raced as she realized the lawyer was about to read Michael's forged version. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, remembering Grace's warning about waiting for the right moment. Mr. Brennan began reading the will aloud. According to the forged document, the family business would be split equally between Thomas and Michael, with Sarah receiving a substantial cash inheritance. The original will had left Thomas in complete control of the company, with much smaller settlements for his siblings. Thomas's face went white with shock. "That can't be right," he said, standing up abruptly. "Father promised the business would be mine alone. Michael has gambling debts that could destroy everything we've built. The document is legally binding and properly witnessed." Mr. Brennan replied, though he looked puzzled. "Your father must have changed his mind about the distribution." Michael tried to look surprised, but Margaret could see the relief and satisfaction in his eyes. "I guess Dad realized that blood is thicker than business agreements," he said with false humility. Sarah looked confused by the entire situation. She had never expected much from her father's will since she had chosen to live abroad, but the substantial inheritance mentioned in the forged document would solve many of her financial problems in London. That night, after the lawyer and family members had left, Margaret remained alone in the mansion. She was responsible for maintaining the house until the family decided what to do with it. As she walked through the empty halls, she felt a presence following her. Grace appeared in the hallway, her young face etched with concern. "The false will has been accepted," she said. "Now the real consequences begin." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Robert's spirit cannot rest while his final wishes are ignored," Grace explained. "He worked his entire life to build something meaningful, and he knew Michael would destroy it with his gambling and poor decisions. The business was meant to go to Thomas alone." As if summoned by Grace's words, Margaret felt a cold wind sweep through the house despite all the windows being closed. Pictures began rattling on the walls, and doors started opening and closing on their own. "Is that Mr. Henderson's spirit?" Margaret whispered. "Yes," Grace replied sadly. "And he's growing stronger and angrier each day. Soon, his rage will affect everyone connected to this family. Employees will lose their jobs, business deals will fail, and tragedy will follow the Henderson name until justice is served." Over the next week, Margaret watched helplessly as Grace's predictions began coming true. The family business started experiencing unexpected problems. Major clients canceled contracts without explanation. Key employees began quitting their jobs, claiming they felt uncomfortable in the office building. Computer systems crashed repeatedly, destroying important files. Thomas tried desperately to maintain control of his half of the company, but every decision he made seemed to backfire. Michael, meanwhile, was already making plans to sell his portion of the business to pay off his gambling debts and fund his expensive lifestyle. Sarah decided to stay in town longer than planned to help manage the crisis, but she found herself plagued by nightmares and unexplained accidents. She spilled coffee on important documents, tripped downstairs, and experienced car troubles every time she tried to leave the mansion. Margaret realized that Robert's angry spirit was affecting everyone except her. As the only person who knew the truth about the forged will, she seemed to be protected from the supernatural chaos surrounding the family. One evening, while Margaret was cleaning the study, she found Thomas sitting alone at his father's desk, with his head in his hands. The stress of the failing business had aged him years in just a few days. "I don't understand what's happening, Maggie," he said wearily. "It's like Dad's ghost is haunting the company. Everything we touch turns to disaster." Margaret felt her heart breaking for the man she had helped raise. Thomas had worked honestly his entire life to earn his father's respect and inherit the family business. He deserved to know the truth about what had happened. "Mr. Thomas," Margaret said carefully, "what if I told you that your father's will might not be what it seems?" Thomas looked up with hollow eyes. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "What if someone altered the will after your father's death? What if the document Mr. Brennan read wasn't the real one?" Thomas stared at her in shock. "That's impossible. The will was locked in Dad's safe. Only family members knew the combination. Michael found the combination written in your father's notebook," Margaret said quietly. "I saw him forge the will with my own eyes." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Thomas's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally, a grim determination. "You saw this happen? You're certain it was Michael?" Margaret nodded. "I should have stopped him, but something told me to wait and watch. I think your father's spirit wanted someone to witness the crime." Thomas stood up slowly, his businessman's mind already calculating the legal implications. If you're telling the truth, we need proof. Your word alone won't be enough to challenge a legally executed will. That's when Grace appeared again, visible only to Margaret. Tell him about the burn marks, the ghostly girl said. Tell him where to look for the evidence he needs. Margaret listened to Grace's instructions and then turned back to Thomas. There might be physical evidence on the forged will, small burn marks where the alterations were made, and I believe there are security cameras that might have recorded Michael in the study that night. Thomas's eyes lit up with hope for the first time in days. If we can prove the will was forged, we can have Michael arrested and restore Dad's true wishes. But as Thomas reached for the phone to call the police, the lights in the study began flickering ominously. The supernatural activity was increasing, and Margaret realized that Robert's spirit was running out of patience. Time was running short to set things right before the ghostly vengeance consumed the entire family. Thomas moved quickly once he learned the truth about the forged will. Early the next morning, he contacted Detective Rodriguez, a police investigator who specialized in white-collar crimes. Margaret agreed to provide her testimony about witnessing Michael's forgery, though she decided not to mention Grace's ghostly warnings. Detective Rodriguez arrived at the mansion with a forensics expert to examine the will and search for evidence. The safe was opened under police supervision, and the forged document was carefully removed for analysis. "Ma'am," Detective Rodriguez said to Margaret, "you mentioned seeing burn marks on the paper. Can you show us where?" Margaret pointed to several spots on the will where Grace's ghostly fingers had touched the document. Under a magnifying glass, the forensics expert could clearly see small scorch marks that corresponded exactly with the areas where text had been altered. "This is unusual," the expert muttered. "It looks like someone used an intense heat source during the forgery process. But I've never seen burn patterns quite like these before." Thomas also remembered his father mentioning a hidden security camera in the study, installed years earlier after some valuable artwork had been stolen. The camera was disguised as a book on the shelf and had been recording continuously for weeks before Robert's death. When police reviewed the security footage, they found clear evidence of Michael's crime. The video showed him entering the study late at night, opening the safe, and spending over an hour altering the will. His face was clearly visible throughout the recording, making denial impossible. Detective Rodriguez arranged for Michael's arrest the following afternoon. When police arrived at Michael's apartment, they found him packing suitcases, apparently planning to leave town with money he had already borrowed against his anticipated inheritance. "Michael Henderson, you're under arrest for forgery, fraud, and tampering with legal documents," Detective Rodriguez announced as officers handcuffed the shocked man. "This is ridiculous," Michael protested. "You can't prove anything. We have video footage of you forging your father's will," the detective replied. "We also have witness testimony and physical evidence. You're going to prison for a very long time." As Michael was led away in handcuffs, the supernatural activity at the mansion began to calm. The lights stopped flickering, doors remained properly closed, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the family started to lift. Margaret felt Grace's presence one final time as she watched the police car drive away with Michael inside. "Justice has been served," Grace said with a peaceful smile. "Robert's spirit can rest now, and the family can heal from this betrayal." "Who were you really?" Margaret asked. "Why did you help us?" Grace's young face grew thoughtful. "I lived in this house long ago, before it belonged to the Henderson family. I died young and have been watching over it ever since, protecting honest people from those who would use lies and deception to steal what isn't theirs." "Will I see you again?" "Perhaps," Grace replied. "If injustice threatens this house again, I'll return. But for now, my work here is done." Grace faded away for the final time, leaving Margaret with a sense of peace and accomplishment. The legal process moved quickly once Michael's guilt was established. Mr. Brennan worked with the police to authenticate Robert's original will, which was found exactly where the old man had intended it to be. The true document left the entire family business to Thomas, with modest cash inheritances for Michael and Sarah. Sarah was shocked by her brother's betrayal but relieved to learn that their father's true wishes would be honored. She decided to stay in town longer, to help Thomas rebuild the company's reputation and restore employee confidence. "I never suspected Michael was capable of something like this," she told Margaret one afternoon as they sat in the mansion's garden. "I mean, I knew he had gambling problems, but forging Dad's will? That's beyond anything I could have imagined." "Desperation makes people do terrible things," Margaret replied wisely. "Your brother convinced himself that he deserved more than your father wanted to give him, and that made it easier to justify his crime." Thomas threw himself into saving the family business with renewed energy. With the supernatural interference gone, deals that had been falling apart were miraculously restored. Employees who had quit returned to their jobs, and new contracts began flowing in at an unprecedented rate. "It's like Dad is helping us from beyond the grave," Thomas told Margaret one evening. "Everything we lost during those horrible weeks is coming back stronger than before." Margaret smiled, knowing that Robert's spirit was indeed at peace and perhaps providing gentle guidance to his eldest son. Michael's trial took place 6 months later. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he eventually pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for the financial damage his actions had caused to the family business. During the trial, Michael finally showed genuine remorse for his actions. "I destroyed the trust of my family and betrayed my father's memory," he said during his sentencing hearing. "I hope someday they can forgive me, though I know I don't deserve it." Thomas and Sarah attended the trial but chose not to speak with Michael afterward. The betrayal had cut too deep, and they needed time to process their feelings about their brother's crimes. After Michael's sentencing, the Henderson family began to heal and move forward. Thomas successfully rebuilt the company into an even stronger organization than before, implementing new ethical standards and transparency measures that made it a model for other businesses in the community. Sarah decided to relocate permanently from London to help manage the family's charitable foundation, turning her organizational skills toward helping others in need. She moved into a wing of the family mansion, bringing life and laughter back to rooms that had been empty for years. Margaret continued working as the family's housekeeper, though Thomas insisted on significantly increasing her salary and benefits. "You saved our family from destruction, Maggie," he said. "We can never repay you for your courage and loyalty." "Taking care of this family has been my life's work," Margaret replied. "Protecting you all from harm was just part of the job." On quiet evenings, Margaret would sometimes walk through the halls of the mansion and remember the strange week when Grace had appeared to guide her toward justice. She never saw the ghostly girl again, but she often felt a peaceful presence watching over the house and its inhabitants. The Henderson family legacy was preserved, built on truth and honor rather than lies and greed. Robert's spirit could finally rest in peace, knowing that his life's work would continue in the capable hands of his honest son. Years later, when people in town spoke of the Henderson family scandal, they marveled at how Margaret Williams, a humble housekeeper, had the courage to expose the truth and save an entire business empire from destruction. But Margaret always insisted she was just doing what any decent person would do when faced with injustice. She never told anyone about Grace's ghostly warnings or the supernatural events that had guided her actions. Some secrets, she believed, were better kept safe in the shadows of memory, where truth and mystery could coexist in perfect harmony. The mansion stood strong and proud, its halls echoing with honest laughter once again, protected by the watchful spirit of a young girl who had learned long ago that justice always finds a way to prevail.